kurz
vor.
Ja, genau.
So, ohne Notizen.
Ja.
Die Eckdaten weiß ich ja schon. Und dann setze ich mich aber auch ins Publikum gleich. So, jetzt gucken wir hier. Hello. Oh yeah, it works very well. So good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome you to one of the last activities of the year. And I'm happy to see people here at all, because Martin told me he was at PUC Rio yesterday afternoon, and no one showed up for the talk. So he was there alone and sad, and decided to go to the beach then anyway. So I'm happy you're all here. And I would briefly like to introduce Martin, who I have already met more than 10 years ago. That shows you how old I am already. When I moved to the University of Tübingen, still during my PhD phase, to work on a research project, and Martin, I think, was just about to leave after finishing his master's at the University of Tübingen. He moved to the Social Science Research Center in Berlin and did his PhD there in the department of Michael Zürn. Yeah, quite a renowned scholar in international relations. And then I think you stayed also there for some time after your PhD, right?
Almost 10 years.
As a postdoctoral researcher, and then recently moved to the University of Reading in the United Kingdom to take up a position, a professorship there. And I think you're now at the level of associate professor, right? So, or senior lecturer, is that the same?
No.
No, okay, anyway, associate professor. Anyway, professor is more known here, and lecturer, no one ever knows what it really means. So, Martin specializes on various topics of international relations, particularly international organizations, in particular the United Nations, questions of international interventions in situations of civil conflict, of human rights violations, of humanitarian crisis, and also the question of the role of rising powers on the world stage, which is the topic of his talk here this afternoon. And as many of you know, tomorrow we'll have a workshop here in the same room on the topic of human rights and international interventions in situations of humanitarian crisis and human rights violations, where Martin also will share some insights of his past and current research on these issues, and where we'll also have a number of presentations by researchers from USP and from other universities, and on different levels or career stages, if you want, who do research on related topics. So it's also going to be pretty interesting, and anybody is also welcome to join us here, even if you want for just one panel or just for Martin's talk in the morning. So it's going to be from 9 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon. And there will be 4 parts, starting with Martin's talk, and then we'll have 3 panels throughout the day. And the program is also available online. You can check my Facebook page, for instance. We have an event page also on Facebook where you can find the full program. So that's the promotion part. And now I'm very happy to give the floor to Martin to present his insights on the role of rising power in the international order, looking particularly on their behavior in the UN General Assembly.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much, Britta, for this kind introduction, and also for your invitation to this prestigious university. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending my talk. I'm not sure you can hear me, so I'm going to sit down again. As I said, for me, it's an honor and a pleasure to present to you some of my research that I'm doing on the United Nations and the rising powers. And it's also a very nice opportunity for me to come back to Brazil, to this wonderful country after a very long time. So I really enjoy my stay here, and also I look very much forward to meeting you tomorrow and to discussing your research and the research on the responsibility to protect and related issues. Okay. Now, my presentation today is based on a paper that I have written with my co-author and friend Autumn Lockwood Payton. We sent the paper to a high-ranking political science journal. We got an R&R, and now we are working on the R&R. So in other words, what I will be presenting here is really work in progress. And so I look very much forward to your comments, to your suggestions, to your critical comments or questions as well. And for me, it's particularly interesting to present this research here because the paper is on rising powers. And so I present it for the first time to an audience in a rising power in Brazil. So I really sort of, hope, and I'm sure I will learn something from you in this afternoon. All right, so let me start by briefly situate our project in the larger context where scholars and observers of international politics argue that the Western-centered, the liberal international order is in a deep crisis. And with respect to international organizations, or IOs, so I'm going to say IO now to save some time, IOs as the major building block of this international order, I think we can observe three major trends. Okay, and the first is that IOs are increasingly politicized. They are politicized in that individuals, citizens, activist groups are now aware that IOs matter. People have started to ask critical questions about the goals and the functioning of these organizations. And sometimes, and you can see this here on the photo, sometimes they even take the protest they take to the street to protest against IOs. Okay, so I would say this is one major trend in international politics with respect to international organizations. The second development, and that's actually the topic of my talk today, is the rise of non-Western powers that have started to confront international organizations in various ways. They demand far-reaching reforms so as to make international organizations better reflect the increased influence of these powers in world politics. Okay, so that's what I would suggest is the second important trend in international politics, and I'm going to discuss this obviously in more detail with you in a minute. And the third trend, and I think importantly, is now that IOs are also challenged from within. Okay, so it seems that even the Western, the liberal core is grumbling. If we look at the UK and Brexit, if we look at the US's withdrawal from UNESCO and from the UN Human Rights Council, and also its challenges to the WTO-based trade regime, Bolton has recently said that the US was trying to kill the ICC and so on, right? And so taken together, I think these trends raise really pressing questions about how legitimate international organizations still are and how much support they still enjoy. And I think this deserves, systematic empirical analysis. And the main motivation of the paper, and now I come back to the actual topic of the talk, the main motivation of the paper I'm presenting here is precisely to examine in a systematic way the implications of the widely observed shift of power from Western states, from the US and from its Western allies, to non-Western states, such as Brazil, India, China, Russia, and South Africa, the BRICS states. And later I will also say a few words about IPSA. Okay. Now, my sense is that this power shift is considered to be one of the most fundamental developments or changes in international politics over the past 2 or 3 decades. And also I would say that few observers today dispute that this power shift is real. Okay? What is much more controversial in the literature, however, is how the rising powers impact the international system. Okay, so what are the implications of this power shift from the Western to the non-Western powers? Will we see increased competition and conflict between the new and the old powers, creating potentially dangerous tensions in international politics? Or do we rather observe the smooth, the harmonious integration of the rising powers into the Western-centered world order? Now, our sense, and that's actually the starting point of this paper, is that much of the existing research on the rising powers focuses on these questions in a rather ad hoc way. Okay, so scholars look at selected foreign policy episodes, or they look at a limited set of actors, very often in US journals, especially the competition between the US and China, or they look at selected issues. Okay, and the contribution of our project to this existing scholarship is to provide a systematic and comparative analysis of rising power behavior by looking at how they vote in the UN General Assembly. Okay, so that's the main idea of the paper. We are not saying that everything that others have done before is not good or wrong, but we offer a different perspective or a different approach on the behavior of rising powers by looking at their voting behavior in the General Assembly. And obviously, I will say a bit more about voting in the GA and how it works and how it can be analyzed later on in my talk. Okay, so to our knowledge, there are only 2 studies so far that have examined rising power voting behavior, and these remain restricted to the analysis of voting cohesion among the rising powers. Okay, and also the findings of these studies are inconclusive. So there's one study by Ferdinand, and he compares the voting behavior of the rising powers in the General Assembly over 6 time periods between 1974 and 2011, and he finds increasing degrees of voting cohesion among them. Okay, so they vote together to a larger extent than before. Now, the second one by Hoijmaiers and Keukeler examine yearly votes that the BRICS have cast in the General Assembly over the period 2006 to 2014. And unlike Ferdinand, they do not observe higher levels of voting cohesion among these powers, and they conclude that it is not, and that's a quote, it's not possible to speak about a cohesive BRICS bloc in the General Assembly. Okay? Now, how do we contribute to this research? We go beyond these studies in 2 important ways. First, we develop and test a theoretical argument that looks at both the rising powers and the established Western powers and the interplay between those 2 groups. And second, to test this argument, we use methods that are better suited to shed light on voting behavior. Ferdinand and Hoijmaier and Keukeler use cohesion scores. So what they do is they simply look at the share of votes in which the rising powers have voted in the same way. Okay? And what we do is we use probabilistic models of voting, spatial models of voting, in order to estimate the preferences or the ideal points of the rising and established powers in a policy space. Okay? And obviously, I will come back and talk a little bit more about the method in a bit. Okay? But so in summary, we say we make a theoretical argument that looks at both rising and established powers, and we use a more sophisticated method. All right. So here is our. Can you see it? You can. Okay. So here I have put a slide with research questions, because when I gave the talk a few days ago in Munich, a PhD candidate has criticized that I didn't show a slide with research questions. So here's the research questions. First, do the rising powers form a bloc? And second, do the rising powers challenge the established Western powers? And our argument is this: yes. We argue that recent developments in international politics have called into question the degree to which the rising powers are still willing to accept the international status quo. Okay, so not even looking at what's going on in Ukraine or in the South China Sea, but only looking at what goes on within international organizations. Okay, so that's the main interest of our research. What is going on within international organization? We find that the rising powers have blocked the WTO Doha round. They have prevented a meaningful response of the UN to the war in Syria. They have called for far-reaching reforms of existing dominated institutions, such as the IMF. And they have created new institutions, competing institutions, such as the new Development Bank. Now, what we suggest is that these actions are not isolated foreign policy episodes, but that they reflect a more generalized pattern of behavior, in that the rising powers have begun to form a bloc of dissatisfied states. And as a bloc, they have started to challenge the established Western powers. Okay, so that's our argument. They have formed a bloc, and as a bloc, they challenge established Western powers in international organizations. And to make this point, to develop this argument, we combine insights from power transition theory and balance of power theory. So Autumn and I, we are not realists, and we also, we are aware that these theories have come with quite some limitations. But we do argue that if we combine specific aspects of both theories, this can help us understand what is going on in international organizations in terms of rising power behavior. Okay. Now, in a first step, so it's a two-step argument, really. So in the first step, we draw on power transition theory to argue that the rising powers have begun to form a bloc of dissatisfied states. Okay? Now, obviously, the rising powers differ in various important ways: a regime type and size and military power and so on and so forth. But we still suggest that they share important commonalities that make them a distinct group. Okay? And here we draw on the work by Andrew Hurrell and others to argue that the rising powers all possess substantial economic, military, and political power. And they were never fully integrated into the liberal international order. They are dissatisfied with the established international leadership, its rules and norms, and have a strong sense of entitlement to play a more influential role in international politics. Some also argue that the rising powers have a common identity in that they perceive themselves of the leaders of the global South. And importantly, this ambition to act as a group is reflected in the institutionalization as IPSA and BRICS states, especially from 2005-06 onwards on. Okay, so that's the first part of our argument, and you will tell me later on whether you find this convincing or not. Okay, now power transition theory directs our attention to the important question of whether a challenger, a rising power, is satisfied or dissatisfied with the international status quo. But ultimately, power transition theory is a power of hegemonic war. And this is not what we expect to happen. So in this respect, power transition theory is not really helpful. And therefore, to understand the behavioral implications of their dissatisfaction, we turn to balance of power theory. Okay? Now, balance of power theory expects automatic balancing by the rising powers, irrespective of whether they are satisfied or dissatisfied. Okay? So, for example, Mearsheimer has argued or predicted that Germany and Japan would develop nuclear arms after the end of the Cold War. And so, the realists or the balance of power guys, they don't really look at dissatisfaction or satisfaction. Okay. However, and that's the useful aspect of balance of power theory, they also focus on competitive behavior below the threshold of the use of military force by directing our attention to the concept of acts of soft balancing. And soft balancing means that weaker powers create costs for dominant states by using non-military tools. Okay, so tools including engaging in diplomatic friction or foot dragging, or also, and this is an argument or a point that has been made by Schweller and Pu in a piece in International Security, by voting against dominant powers in international institutions. Okay, so balance of power transition theory directs our attention to whether rising powers are satisfied or dissatisfied with the international status quo, and balance of power help us to understand the implications of this dissatisfaction in that they point to soft balancing. And in one form of soft balancing is voting against dominant powers in international institutions. Okay? Now, our argument challenges competing views on rising powers in rising power behavior in important ways. Okay? First, it runs counter to the dominant view that the rising powers are a set of highly heterogeneous actors with diverging preferences and strategies. That's a quite prominent argument in the literature, where scholars argue all the rising powers have in common is a strong preference for state sovereignty. But secondly, our argument also challenges the dominant optimistic view, most prominently made by John Eikenberry, but also by Miles Kahler and others, that the rising powers will integrate themselves harmoniously in the Western-centered order. Okay? And why is that? Why would they integrate themselves harmoniously? Why should we expect peace and harmony? According to Eikenberry, this is because the existing order is harder to overturn. Okay, so in the past, the international order has been overturned by war. War is not an option anymore. And so necessarily, change in the international system is less radical and more incremental. And second, and even more importantly, Eikenberry argues that the rising powers have no interest in challenging the established order because they benefit from the rules, they benefit from the institutions, and it is also through this liberal order that the rising powers have risen in power. Okay, so that's the argument that we challenge in the paper. Now, here is our research strategy. Okay, so what we do to test our argument is we examine the voting behavior of rising and established powers in the UN General Assembly. We look at voting in the General Assembly because voting against the status quo powers is considered to be both an expression of dissatisfaction and a form of soft balancing. And I've mentioned this already. Also, power transition theorists have looked at voting behavior in the GA to find out whether a state is satisfied or dissatisfied with the international status quo in the leadership. They also have measures such as alliance portfolios and so on. The General Assembly is also an ideal testing ground for our argument, as voting provides us with consistent data on the preferences of a large number of states. Okay, basically all members of the UN vote in the General Assembly, and this data helps us to, identify these preferences both over time and across a broad range of issues in world politics, such as human rights, nuclear proliferation, economic development, and so on. Okay, now to compare rising power voting over time, we look at 2 time periods. Okay, so we compare 2 time periods each 10 years. The first decade after the end of the Cold War, and then the other decade after September 11, when the rising powers have begun to institutionalize as BRICS and IPSA. And finally, we compare the BRICS and IPSA groups as rising powers to the G7, okay, the group of the G7, and that is formed by the major Western powers. Okay. Now, we are aware that voting in the General Assembly suffers from a number of limitations. Okay, so some are listed here, and I'd be happy to discuss this later on in more detail in the Q&A part. But in the paper, we explain why those problems are not really, or these issues are not really a problem for our analysis. Okay. Now, importantly, and that is the last slide on the argument and the research strategy, our argument carries two observable implications when it comes to voting. Okay. So if our argument is correct, and the rising powers have begun to form a bloc, okay, if this is correct, then we should observe a convergence of their voting behavior, a convergence of their preferences over time, okay? And if they are dissatisfied and if they soft balance against the established powers, then we should observe that they consistently vote against the established powers in the General Assembly, okay? However, if we are wrong and Eikenberry is right and others are right, and if the rising powers form a heterogeneous group of actors, then we should observe diverging voting patterns in the General Assembly. They should be all over the place, okay? And if processes of integration and socialization are going on, we should observe, so if Eikenberry is right and there's socialization, integration, we should observe that over time, the established and the rising powers vote in increasingly similar ways, okay? So a convergence of their voting behavior over time. Okay. So are you still with me here, or should I do a quick summary of the argument and the observable implications? I mean, the observable implications is quite important because otherwise the next few slides make no sense, okay? So we argue the rising powers form a block of dissatisfied states and they challenge the established powers. And if this is correct, we should see convergence among the rising powers and different voting patterns between the rising and established powers. If the others are right and Eikenberry is right with his socialization and integration argument, we should observe that the rising powers are either all over the place or that they have converged over time and they move closer to the established powers. Okay, that's what we should expect. And to find this out, we use probabilistic models of voting. Okay. Now, I will keep this very brief and very simple. Okay. We use two methods. One is called W-nominate, and the other is a model based on item response theory. The key thing of these models is that they use information about the ways states vote in the General Assembly, yay, nay, or abstain or abstention, and they use this information to estimate the ideal points of those states in a one- or two-dimensional policy space. Okay, and I'm going to show you some spatial maps so that this becomes clearer. Okay, but it's not; they do not actually calculate the share of overlap between the rising and established powers voting behavior. They use a probabilistic model to estimate the ideal point. Now, W-nominate is useful, and I like it very much because it gives us information about the content of the vote. Okay, so we can see, it can tell us something about, is it about human rights or nuclear disarmament or other issues in international politics, while dynamic IRT models are better at grasping change over time. Okay, so one problem with W-nominate is that you cannot always compare different time periods. Okay, and therefore we combine the two models. And I will show you this in a bit. Okay, if you have questions on the method, I'd be happy to discuss it in more detail after the talk. Okay, so now what do we find? Okay, so this is an example. This is the first spatial map, W-nominate, for the period 1992 to 2001. Okay, and so unfortunately, it's very small here on the on this slide. So I'm going to walk you through. Okay. So what you see here is, so it's the first decade, 1992 to 2001. Okay, and what you can see here, the W-nominate analysis produces a two-dimensional policy space with an x-axis and a y-axis. Okay. Now the problem is that with W nominate, we do not know what these dimensions actually are about. You know, what is it? So in a national parliament for which Congress, for instance, US Congress, for which W nominate has been developed, it's usually the first dimension is usually left-right on the political spectrum, and the second dimension is very often incumbent versus opposition. Okay. Now Higgs has used this method for the European Parliament, and in the European Parliament, the first dimension is also usually left-right, and then the other one is pro or anti-European integration. Okay, and the first dimension is empirically much more important than the second one. Okay, but it's still, you know, we can disagree over many issues. It's not necessarily left or right. We can also disagree over, you know, questions of whatever, migration or the environment. Okay, so what we have done is, we have used 3 methods to identify what these dimensions could possibly be. The first is visual inspection, okay, because you can see here how all these dots represent states, and you can see here that those are mainly the non-Western states and those are mainly the Western states, the G7. You can also use the cutting lines, okay, so those cutting lines, nuclear proliferation, human rights, and economic development, speak to the first dimension, and so we know that rising Western and non-Western states very often disagree about human rights and also economic development. Plus, there is some existing research done by Eric Wülten, who has also established that this first dimension is a West non-West ideology. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. So the second one is more difficult. And here we suggest that the second one is the Palestinian question. Okay, so again, the cutting line here helps us. This one, this is the Israel-Palestine conflict. Okay, and you can see here the angle of this cutting line is much closer. It's almost horizontal, right? And it speaks much more to the second dimension here. And then what we have done too, as a statistical solution, is we have used all the values of the ideal points on the y-axis, and we have regressed them on a set of state characteristics, and whether a state has formal diplomatic relations with Israel is highly correlated with the values on the second dimension. Okay, and so we have reason to believe that the second dimension is about the Palestinian question. Okay, so we have these two. We have the policy space. We now have an idea what the 2 dimensions could possibly be. Okay, so then we have the rising powers here. Okay, the blue triangles. And what we have done is we have simply calculated the group centroid for each group, the rising powers and the established powers, the G7. Okay, so that's the midpoint. On a one-dimensional policies dimension, this would be just the midpoint of the 2 groups. And here it's the centroid. Okay, so what do we find? Okay, coming back to the argument. So what we find is that clearly in the first decade, the rising powers did not form a bloc in the General Assembly, because India and China are far removed from the group centroid. Okay, Russia is basically in the Western camp and votes together with the Western powers against the rising powers on human rights and nuclear proliferation. And so this is consistent about what we know in international politics, when in the Yeltsin era, Russia moved to the Western camp, became a member of the G7-8, became a member of the Council of Europe, and sort of this reflects the democratization of Russian politics at that time. So the first finding is no, clearly they didn't form a bloc at that time. So what about the G7? Okay, so here you can see the G7, so they are much more coherent, they are much closer to the group centroid, and the only one that's a little bit an outlier is the US, okay, which is also consistent with the role of the US in international politics, sometimes described as the lonely superpower, but still it's quite cohesive. And importantly, the established powers, they always vote together, okay, because here these lines, these are the cutting lines, okay, and this line, for instance, represents all the votes on nuclear proliferation. And if states are on the same side of this line, they vote together in the General Assembly. And if they are on the other side of the line, they vote against it. Okay, so you can see here that, you know, the cutting lines, the G7 always voted together. They are always on the same side of all 4 cutting lines, and they are also always in a minority, almost all the time outvoted by the majority of the members in the United Nations and in the General Assembly. Okay. And when we then look at the second time period, okay, we can see that the picture changes quite dramatically, okay, because here you can see that the rising powers now have formed a bloc with in the course of the institutionalization of the BRICS and IPSA states. They are much closer to the centroid. Russia is still a little bit apart and votes in different ways on 2 issue areas, okay, which is consistent with the literature that says that among the rising powers, Russia really does not fit in so well because it's a declining power, and it's not really part of the rising power group. But still, we can see it has under Putin it has moved away from the Western group. Okay, we can also see that the Western group is still a bloc. Okay, but we can also see that now they are split, or they disagree when it comes to Israel-Palestine resolutions, where the US and Canada vote together against the other members of the group, and also against the large majority of the members in the General Assembly. Okay, and so here all the dots and the triangles that are shaded in gray are all the other states in the UN. Okay, and here it's too close to too small to see, but they represent the regional groups: Latin America, the Western and others groups, Africa, Asia, and so on. Okay. Okay. So now, as I said, W-nominate is not so good in grasping change over time. So we cannot fully trust, okay, this result. So we used IRT. IRT does not tell us anything about the content of the vote, but you can see the same dynamic here. So if you go back here, okay, so here far removed and dispersed, so not a block, and then in the next decade a convergence of the voting behavior, and the exact same dynamic is reflected here in this figure based on IRT results. So here, very different preferences, and then over time, with the formation of the BRICS and IPSA states, there is this clear and dramatic convergence of the preferences. Okay, because those are the ideal points. Okay, and this shows that, for instance, here Russia and India and China had very different ideal points on the first dimension, because this has only one dimension, right? So here you have a 2-dimensional policy space, but here there is only one dimension, okay? And this is the time. Then we have calculated a mean ideal point for the rising powers in blue, and the mean ideal point for the rising powers and the rising powers in blue, sorry, and the established in red, and you can once again see, you know, that they are quite distant from one another. Okay, so there is no convergence between the rising and established powers. Their ideal points and their preferences are very far away from each other, and over time, the distance remains quite stable. Okay. Okay, so now this is just visual inspection. We have then also, and this will be difficult to see, but I'm going to explain it very briefly, and I will also come to the end of my presentation in a bit. Okay, so here we have simply calculated all the distances that I showed you in the graphs. Okay, we have 2 models. One is the W-nominate. Then we have IRT, where abstentions are counted as nay, or modeled as nay, and we have IRT where abstentions are a midpoint, because there's this debate in literature that says, you know, voting no abstaining in the General Assembly is a softer form of saying no. And the others say, oh no, abstention is something, it's in between a yes and a no. Okay? So we have modeled both as a robustness check. Okay? But what you can see here in the first column is the first decade and then the second decade. And you can see here in the dispersion scores that the dispersion, decreased dramatically by more than 50% or even more than 50% here, meaning that the rising powers have moved or are now much more consistent. Okay, and the way to calculate this is very easy. But I'm gonna, if you're interested in this, I can explain it later on. So we can see that G7 is also the dispersion is quite low. Okay. But it remains, it's relatively stable. Okay, so here the dispersion score is 0.5, and it drops to 0.25 over in the second period. And then we have also calculated the distance scores. So this is basically the second graph that I showed you with the red and the blue lines for the rising and established powers average ideal point. And so you can see here it remains relatively stable, but it is above 1. Okay, so the distance is actually quite large across all models. Okay, and what this means is substantively, and so I have put you just some information here that the distance is really meaningful. Okay, a distance of 1 is really meaningful because, for instance, you can see here the distance between the US and Israel is 0.02. So they vote together all the time. Germany and France, the distance is 0.19, okay, because they're allies in the EU. And so US and North Korea is 2. 2 is the maximum. So this means that almost always do the North Koreans and the US vote in different ways in the General Assembly. And so and the average distance so the distance that we find is nearly 2.5 times greater than the average distance in the General Assembly, meaning that the distance between the rising and established powers is actually quite large. Okay. Okay. So very brief summary. Okay. Our analysis yields 3 main findings. The first is that we observe a clear convergence in rising power voting behavior in the General Assembly. Okay. The second is that there is a large distance between rising powers and established powers. So we don't find the Eichen-Berry socialization and integration dynamic. But also, the distances remain relatively stable over time. Okay? But the important point here is to say, well, okay, they remain stable over time. But the first thing is rising powers now act as a group, so the big distance matters more. And even more important, the rising powers are now much more powerful. Okay? So they don't disagree more often, but the disagreement is more important because the rising powers are more salient. And some would argue that they're even system relevant, right? Because the G8 has been extended to the G20 because the Western powers came to the realization that they cannot manage the global economy without the rising powers anymore. Okay, and so a distance or different preferences between rising and established powers matter more as the rising powers become system relevant. Okay. Now, obviously, I have now talked only about voting in the General Assembly. And so in the paper, we also illustrate and bring anecdotal evidence, qualitative evidence, as to why what we observe in the voting behavior actually matters. Okay, and I'm only going to read out one statement of a senior U.S. official in the Obama administration who said that it's remarkable how closely coordinated Brazil, South Africa, India, China have become in international fora, taking turns to impede US-EU initiatives. And there is more qualitative evidence out there to support our argument. Okay? So overall, we find support for our argument. we have suggested to look at the rising power behavior through the analytic lens of their voting behavior in the General Assembly. You know, perhaps there is integration and socialization going on, but at least this is not reflected in the voting in the General Assembly. Now, we have only looked at the General Assembly and only looked at voting behavior, so, you know, we think that more research is needed, as always. And so we need also to look at the behavioral implications. So, for instance, you know, is voting consequential in that the rising powers also, you know, oppose the Western powers in other fora or in other ways? And then also, and this is a research group I'm currently a member of in Munich, we should also look at how the rising powers are successful or not successful in changing international institutions, okay? Because sometimes, you know, the IMF, other institutions, they change, they adapt to the rising powers, and others, such as the Security Council, they do not, okay? So more research is needed. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to your to all the questions and comments you may have.
So, comments, questions.
Please don't be shy. I came all the way. I came all the way from Berlin,
hoping to get some insightful comments.
Yeah, or just questions. That's also fine. Okay.
I think you have to use the microphone. Yeah, but for the transmission, I have no idea how this here works. Oh, I wrote it. No, I repaired it again. I think it works.
Okay. Thank you, Martin, for your presentation. And I was thinking about this voting behavior when you compare basically two groups. And there is, of course, an impact of this voting behavior. And what do you think is this impact on human rights protection and institutions? Because I think it's kind of my interest, this kind of research. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. What is the impact of the voting behavior? I mean, this is also a question that we got from one of the reviewers, who said, you know, we don't only want to see the voting patterns, we also want to see real behavior, real action. And so we were quite upset, thinking, is this not enough, you know, looking at voting? There's so many papers, they only look at voting behavior. So why, you know, do we need to do more? And obviously it's always, I mean, it's good, and we do it in the paper, to bring additional evidence, you know, where, you know, we look at actual behavior. So let's take a look at what is going on in the human rights area. Okay, so if you look here at this spatial map, the second time period, human rights is this line. Okay, so it's dotted. Okay, can you see it? And so these are all resolutions. Okay, and I should add that the data has been collected by Wöthen in the US and his collaborators, right? So we have not collected all the resolutions. What they have done, they went back to 1946 and they have collected all the roll calls, okay? And then they went through the text and they have coded, is this a resolution that is related to human rights or to nuclear proliferation or Israel-Palestine conflict or question or nuclear proliferation, okay? So that they have done it, and we just used the data to estimate the ideal points, okay? And so this is then the line of human rights, okay? And then in 2002 to 2011, so I think half of the votes were cast. So 750 roll calls were there, so maybe let's say 25%, let's say 200 votes on human rights, okay? And then the model looks at all the votes. So let's assume, so it's 200 roll call votes on human rights, and then they look for every state, how did they vote? Yes, no, yes, 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 no, 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 yes, 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 no, no, and so on, to estimate the ideal point. And then sometimes, you know, the states got it wrong, there's perceptual error, so therefore you also need to include in the model an error term, okay? Otherwise it would be just perfect voting, and this is not reasonable. So we can see here that India, China, South Africa, and Brazil vote together with the vast majority of non-Western states, okay, on the roll calls on human rights, again, against Russia and the other Western powers, okay? So clearly, human rights is a conflict line in international politics. It's an important fault line in international politics. And I have written a book chapter about the demands of the rising and established powers when the Human Rights Council was created. Okay, so I have compared all the statements and all the demands of the rising powers about how powerful the Human Rights Council should be and what competences it should have, and whether it should be an intrusive institution that names and shames human rights violators. And I have compared this, and it's a co-authored paper, and I have compared this to the demands of the Western powers. Okay? And so, not surprisingly, because human rights is a long-standing issue in international politics, the rising powers, and especially the non-Western powers, they want more cooperation, more technical assistance, less confrontation, no conflict, no country-specific resolutions. They don't want to be blamed in the Human Rights Council. And they want more, sort of redistribution and help. And so here, this is not fully consistent with what we find here. And in this analysis, so this was my point, Brazil was in the camp of the Western powers. So Brazil was much more in favor of a strong and intrusive Human Rights Council than the other rising powers. Okay, yeah, and so this was one of the findings in this book chapter. So here it's different. Okay, so here we can see that if you look at the content of the vote, I'm pretty sure, because I have looked at them. These are votes where a resolution is suggested, a draft resolution to condemn human rights violations in a country, and the Western powers, they want to pass the resolution and condemn a human rights violator, and the rising powers vote against it. But then it would be Israel-Palestine. It's the non-Western powers that want to condemn Israel for some human rights violations, and then the Western powers vote against it. But you can see here clearly it's a fault line in international politics. And how this plays out in terms of responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention is something that we will be discussing tomorrow, I guess, in more detail, because my argument would be it has behavioral implications. Yeah, it was a very long answer. Sorry for that.
Yeah, let me just mention that Eric Wörthen was also here, I think about a year ago or so, to present his research. So maybe some of the people here in the audience were present when he gave his talk and introduced also his data on voting in the UN General Assembly, etc. And well, we also have Carolina here, who I had the pleasure yesterday at the International Relations Institute to be on the examining board of their master thesis, which actually had a lot of similarities with your research here, because she analyzed voting behavior of Latin American states in the UN Human Rights Council. And then some issues, for instance, she also used this nominate methodology, and also this Palestine dimension popped up as a relevant conflict line. So I don't know, maybe you have some observations or remarks if you want. You need to use the microphone, sorry for that.
Well, first, thank you for your presentation. I just have a very brief question, which is concerning your IRT models, which I'm not very familiar with. But You did show in the table, but I wasn't able to notice by the numbers if you got any different results by considering the two models when it comes to abstention. So if you could talk a little bit about the results of the two models,
yes.
I'll be thankful.
Yes, okay. Thanks for the question. So the lame answer to this is that my co-author Autumn knows this much better than I do, but it's not fully true, because I also have installed R on my computer and I ran some of the W-nominate. So, but I feel more comfortable in answering questions about W-nominate. But what you can see here, okay, and I guess because this is so Eric Wilton has written this paper on the IRT model together with two colleagues, Stresnev and Michael Bailey, okay? And so we looked at the code, okay, because W-nominate there's only two choices, yay and nay, and abstentions are merged together with yay and nay, because otherwise this is all the model can do. And to estimate this, it took us 5 days, the computer 5 days, to come up with the convergence in the IRT model, okay? And so to make it comparable, we had to write a code, and this is something that Autumn did, to write a code. Where is it? Okay, so this is that's the original. That is Eric Wilton's and Bailey's code, where yay and nay, where abstentions are a midpoint between yay and nay. And so we couldn't use this directly because the W-nominate only has yay and nay, and abstentions count as nay. And so we had to write our own code. And so Michael Bailey gave us access to his Dropbox. And so Autumn has written this. Okay, so what do we find? We can see here. So dispersion score means how spread are the ideal points of the bricks. And so we can see here the W-nominate, it decreases by 50%. In the IRT model, it decreases by 60%. And then with abstention as a midpoint, it's almost 80%. So IRT, the values, the scores are a bit higher, or actually much higher than what we find with W-nominate. But overall, it lends support to our argument, because our argument is if we are right, we should see some convergence among the rising powers. And already minus 50% is quite impressive, but the IRT models, lend even stronger support to our argument. With the bricks, with the IPSA, it's basically the same, okay, except here, the IRT model, the model 3, it's a little bit less, okay. So there is a difference between the W-nominate, but it's not that it showed, that it has increased. So it's still a significant decrease, but the effect is weaker than in the first model. And with the G7, it's basically the same across all models, right? And the same applies to the distances, except for the BRICS G7 distance, where the W-nominate model shows us that it has remained more or less the same, +2, and the IRT with abstentions as a midpoint, it's minus 20%. Okay, so this is a bit of an outlier, and it tells us that it can make a difference how you model abstentions and how you deal with abstentions. Okay, but over the three models and the different measures, I think that our results are quite robust, and this enhances the trust in our results, because just the W-nominate, probably be difficult to draw conclusions, especially over time, which is why we need the IRT model. Okay, so the results are it's not identical, but it points into the same direction.
Any other questions? Yeah, please. I have two questions. Thank you for your conference. It's very interesting.
first question is the convergence between the rising powers is a result of opposition of the blocs. Mm-hmm. It means the countries are voting as IBSA, as BRICS, as a bloc, or it's just a coincidence of individual preferences. And I have the second question is from a colleague who is online. You are online on the TV.
Okay. Oh, okay.
And he sent a question by WhatsApp. No.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes.
So that's very...
It's Amancio. It's
Okay.
a colleague from the Institute of International Relations. It's a methodological question. Do you know some example of machine learning to improve ideal point estimation?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thanks for your question. Okay. So the first one is a tough one, and I got this question before. So let me just go through to this graph, okay, or the map. So here we can see in the first decade the rising powers are all over the place, and then there is this convergence, okay. And now the question is, what drives the convergence, right? So maybe just by coincidence, the rising powers vote in specific ways, and they happen to vote in similar ways, and therefore we see the convergence. It has nothing to do with forming a bloc, right? And so obviously that's a good point, because the voting itself, okay, why they form a bloc, and this is also something that we are working on at the moment. It could be driven by different dynamics, okay. So one would be coordination. So they meet at the BRICS summit, and then they say, next time we will vote together as a bloc. Or it could be that it is a result of external pressure. Right? So maybe they feel they are under threat, and therefore they vote together. So now in this iteration, and also a similar paper with a different argument will be published soon in a OUP book chapter, and there we argue that we don't make any assumptions about what the dynamics that drive this pattern, okay. But what we can clearly see is that there is this institutionalization as BRICS and IBSA. There are many things, many areas where the rising powers work together. Brazil and India have worked together in the context of the World Trade Organization to form part of the Quad. They have deadlocked the Doha round. Other scholars find discursive alignment among the BRICS members in UN General Assembly debates. But the question is a good one. So how much coordination do we need to see to speak of a bloc? And here I have put on a quote. In the sense we use the term, it is any group which consistently votes as a unit on all or particular kinds of issues. Okay, and in that sense, it would qualify as a bloc. If the definition of a bloc is that it also requires coordination, and this is something that may well go on behind closed doors, well then it's difficult for us to make this argument. But it's a good point. Now, machine learning. So all of this is already incredibly tricky, right? If you just look at the book by Poole, the 2005 book, and how he explains the algorithms for W-nominate. I mean, you have probably taken a close look at the book. It's quite complex. So I think Eric Wilson and Michael Bailey, they are the ones to improve the method. We apply the method. We use the method. We don't want, our aim is not, or our ambition is not to make a methodological contribution to the debate. But there is a very interesting way to estimate ideal points based on the speeches that the member states give or the statements that they make in the General Assembly. And it's a paper that has been published in Research and Politics recently, and I have even invited one of the authors to our research seminar in Reading, but I now have forgotten his Slava. His first name is Slava Mikhailovic or something like that. I can look it up and send it. And they use machine learning, so quantitative text analysis, where they use the text and then based on the text, not on yes, no voting patterns, but on the text, they estimate ideal points for the member states. So this might be of interest for your colleague.
Thank you, Martin. I also have two questions. First of all, are you thinking of researching the years after 2011? Because I was thinking that maybe some things have changed. For example, economic crisis or the Arab Spring, I don't know, then Trump.
Yeah.
Then maybe some things have changed, I don't know. And then the second question, if you could just comment on the problems with researching the General Assembly. Because you just mentioned, then maybe if you could comment.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. So the first point, the time period, because now there's new data available. So Eric updates this every now and then, and I think the latest iteration of the data set goes up to 2015. Now, I don't want to do the analysis again, but the deeper concern here is, maybe all of this whole BRICS thing, the rising powers and the hype, it's over. And there is a very interesting paper published in International Affairs, written by Kristin Hopewell, who makes this point. I mean, makes a really good point. So she goes through the literature review and gives a discussion of all the people who argue that the BRICS thing is over, mainly because of a recession and economic crisis, or that it has never existed in the first place. But she then goes on to show that despite economic problems, that the BRICS and the rising powers as a bloc, at least in the WTO context, that they now exist as a political force, right? And this speaks also to the other point, to the extent to which they coordinate. And she argues that Brazil and India have managed to get China on board, even though China has somehow different preferences with respect to world trade, and that they really work together as a group in the WTO, and that that this is not something that is not just a thing that was there in the 2000s and now it went away. But I also had yesterday a discussion with Andrea Ribeiro Hoffman from PUCI in Rio, and she said that she was not so convinced about this idea of the rising powers building a bloc. And she argued that for Brazil, the most important country now is China. And that China is so much more powerful than the rest of the rising powers that talking about the rising powers as a bloc, and then China is just a member of that bloc, is not plausible to her. She says maybe in the time period we are looking at but now she thinks that this has shifted. And so I'm really curious to hear your opinions on this, right? So I mean, you can see the patterns on the slides, but does it, from what you know about Brazilian foreign policy and the BRICS and IPSA and all this, is it somehow plausible? Or would you say, oh no, all the foreign policies episodes I know is where, Brazil has, been in totally disagreement with the other rising powers. So that's one point. So we could extend it, and maybe we would see different things, and maybe we would also see, and I think we should do it, and probably we will do it. So what's going to happen with the Trump administration, right? Because one idea would be that actually the U.S., in many ways now under Trump, is maybe much closer to the preferences of Russia for obvious or maybe not so obvious reasons, or agrees much more, maybe with India it's different, but disagree much more with the other members of the G7 over so many issues, right? And so an interesting question would be, is this reflected in the voting in the General Assembly? Can we see something of this, a change here? Or is there just discontinuity in the administration, right? Because sometimes it's really small technical things. And this leads me to the second point, the problems in looking at the GA. And so one common criticism is that it is purely symbolic, right? So it's non-binding in international law. It's not like a Security Council resolution that is binding to all UN member states. But they go there, they vote, then they go home. No one cares. Is this not a problem? And our answer to this is, no. Actually, this is a strength of voting in the General Assembly, because the General Assembly is the only place where states can express themselves relatively freely. They go there, they vote. We would say quite sincerely. They express their preferences, and also, for instance, there is a unit in the U.S. State Department that records and analyzes all the votes of the recipients of U.S. aid and U.S. allies, and they want to know whether they vote with the U.S. Or not. And it's somehow contradictory to the first argument that they can express themselves freely. But I think in a way it is, because it is just voting. The second problem is the problem of vote buying. So there is this literature by Axel Dreher and others who argue that actually it's not sincere, because votes are bought. So if the U.S. gives loans to states, development aid, or the IMF gives loans to states, then they will vote closer, or they will vote together with the Western donors. And so here our argument is that, first of all, it's not clear whether this is really going on. So some studies find that vote buying happens in the General Assembly. Others find it does not. But even if there was vote buying, right, then we would expect that if the rising powers get loans or assistance from the Western powers, they would move closer to the Western powers, right? So if our argument was, there is convergence or socialization, then this would be problematic, because we could not distinguish whether this is actual preference alignment or whether it's just an effect of vote buying. Okay? But our argument is the exact opposite. So we say they move further apart, or there is no convergence, right? And so in this sense, I think the vote buying argument would be a hard test for our argument, because it makes our argument even stronger, because we see this big difference in spite of potential vote buying. And then the third and probably the most tricky argument is that the roll calls are just a minority of the decisions in the General Assembly. Very often there is a vote, and it's not really recorded because it's a show of hand or acclamation, and so 60% of the resolutions in the General Assembly are adopted without a vote. And so we cannot use this information, we cannot use those votes, because there is no ideal point, and there's nothing to calculate or to estimate. And so what we did is we went through those votes, and what we found is that very often those are resolutions where the Secretary General is asked to deliver a report, or where it's admin stuff, the selection of new senior members of some committees and things like this. But whenever, or very often, when the onus is on the member states, when a resolution or a decision creates costs for UN members, then they will put it to a vote. So we think that that it is appropriate actually to look at the roll calls and not to put so much weight on the votes that are adopted without a vote, because it seems to reflect consensus or agreement, but everybody can agree to create additional work for the Secretariat. And so this argument that, we underestimate the extent or the degree of consensus or agreement among the rising and established powers, I think it's not so convincing. That would be, again, a very long answer to you.
Any other questions? Well, so if that's not the case, I would like to thank you very much, Martin, for your talk, and for everybody who asked a question for your questions, everybody who did not ask a question for your reflections, and for being here. And again, I want to repeat the invitation to come also join us for the workshop tomorrow if you want, if you have time. Or access Martin's publications, which are accessible in several academic journals, and I'm sure he would also be willing to facilitate things if you are particularly interested in one of the aspects mentioned here during the talk. So thank you very much, and for those of you whom I won't see anymore, have a nice Christmas and pleasant holidays.
Yeah, let me also thank you once again for the invitation, and thanks for great questions and comments, and also for attending my talk. I don't know, maybe we still have the opportunity to discuss a few things bilaterally now after the talk, or go to the pub. No, there is no pub.
Not close
That's
by.
what we do here. Okay. Okay.
And it's not called pub.
Wie ist es? Was ist es called? Bar. Barrio.
Ja.
Nee, Barrio ist auch falsch.
Bar oder
Bar.
was gibt's noch?
Gibt es vielleicht gar keine Bars?
Doch, Bar gibt's schon.